Okay, so it has just gone 12 o'clock. So we will start the session. Thank you so much to everybody for joining us today. Today we are joined by two speakers. We've got Ollie Browning and Craig Hamill from Go1. Ollie is head of sales and has over 20 years of experience in the L&D industry, working with clients, developing organizational performance through learning transformation. And Ollie and his team in the UK support clients on their journey to improving the performance of learning in this digital world. And we're also joined by Craig Hamill, and Craig is the Senior Customer Success Manager at Go1. He is a former head of L&D and has 20 years of experience in supporting regional and global learning projects. Craig now supports enterprise L&D teams to deliver digital learning strategies to global workforces. So it is a pleasure to have them both here today. We can see them there, which is good to see. I'm going to hand over to Ollie to begin.
Great, thanks, Pauline. And yeah, just to echo your comments, thanks for joining on this sunny day in the main, and it's really great to see a variety of people in a variety of locations, including I saw someone from Kentucky, so I assume that's a very early start for you. So thank you for joining us, and hopefully you're going to find what we have to talk about of interest. So to set the scene, what we wanted to share was a sort of combination of some insights that we have learned over the last sort of 20 years, particularly from Craig's experience in L&D, and many of you as practitioners will recognise some of this, but more specifically recently how we've been, or how we continue to work with our clients on a strategic basis to sort of drive more impact through digital learning. So hopefully what you're going to get from this is sort of some practical tips, some of which you may know, but hopefully there's some new ideas and a bit of structure as to sort of help you embark on the journey. As Pauline said, please feel free to ask questions, and we'll try and tackle as many of those as we can. So I suppose to kick things off, you know, what a year it's been. Like for everybody in every walk of life, there's been sort of significant disruption, and you know what that's driven in our industry is sort of a lot of digital adoption. You know, outside of that, you know, we're all sort of perhaps coming to the end of our experience with Zoom and Teams and sort of digital adoption of external productivity platforms, etc., but also in the learning space. And what we've seen from that, and I was chatting to Ed Monk, many of you know as CEO of the LPI recently, about how people have tackled that. And some of the response to the pandemic has perhaps not always been strategic. So there's some examples of organisations who have just pivoted very quickly and perhaps just replaced face-to-face immediately with a digital solution. And whether or not that's the right answer, time will tell. And others are perhaps, you know, taken a slightly more strategic approach and considering some sort of alternative ways. But there's a number of different ways people have adapted. But perhaps what's most prevalent is that there seems to be more learning activity taking place, perhaps due to better learning access, but also, you know, the continued drive and sort of challenge of skills. And, you know, it's well documented and spoken about from a number of sources about how hard it is to validate the impact of learning on a business. It's often the sort of holy grail in many organizations and perhaps siloed to particular parts of a learning strategy. But, you know, never has it become more important as organizations, I think, are pressured certainly to try and deliver more with less. And if there was, you know, if you were all on camera, perhaps we get some nodding heads at that particular challenge from your exec, either saying, you know, we can't have as much budget, times are difficult, or, you know, I'm only going to provide more budget and more investment if we can sort of demonstrate, you know, where that's going to deliver business impact. So just a few very small reflections of what's been happening predominantly throughout last year, but that's really sort of continued into this year. So just to set the scene, I don't want to take too much time doing this, but just sort of why do we have a point of view on this particular part of the market? So what we recognise in the market is that there is a growing demand for skills. As again, as I said, it's been well documented, the sort of skills gap challenge. There's an increasing demand on delivering more learning to more roles within an organisation. And specifically within the digital context, we see that as a real complex challenge for people. So, you know, this diagram represents, you might need a Skillsoft library for your technology training, or you might need Trilent for your compliance training. So there's lots of different choice out there in the market. You only have to go to one of the exhibitions and sort of no doubt contacted from various organizations to just know the vast amount of choice that's available, specifically with content, putting sort of platforms, etc. aside. And that presents a challenge. There's often compromise. You know, how much budget do you have? How much budget do you allocate to which of those problems? So Go1's sort of existence in life is to really try and solve that very specific challenge by providing all of the content available from a range of global providers, about 150 today, in a single subscription. So sort of one subscription, one access to a vast range of content that can solve, or at least contribute to, the skills and the capability needs of a number of different skills within the organization. And that content can either be delivered within your own LMS or within an external platform. So I don't want to indulge too much more in that, but that's the insights we get. We're in a very privileged position where we get a lot of insight from 150 of the global leading providers, and as a global organizations, you know, hundreds of customers globally, and in terms of what they're doing and the challenges, and this sort of feels it gives us the position to sort of talk to you today about some of what we've learned. Oh, I clicked the wrong button, doesn't help. So to sort of start that journey, given more and more people are adopting it, you know, we're in a very fortunate position. Our business is growing very fast, and we're supporting organizations on that journey. But perhaps a sort of alarming statistic was one that was recently shared from Fosway, that, you know, almost 60% of L&D teams think adoption of digital learning is immature. Perhaps many reasons for that. You know, I sort of talk quite a lot with customers of, you know, let's not just deliver a build it and they will come strategy, because that often doesn't work. Like, technology or learning content isn't going to solve a problem unless A, you know what the problem is, and B, there's a motivation to solve it. So I thought it was an interesting reflection of why is learning not being adopted, and sort of what are some of the challenges around that. So before we get into maybe helping you solve some of those challenges, I just wanted to pose this question. So this is a model that we work with internally, that sort of simply represents the maturity of an L&D organisation or learning organisation, very similar to that of what we might have seen from Towards Maturity in the past in the work that Laura Overton does. But essentially, this takes you on a journey from, at the bottom end, perhaps your learning is quite tactical, often reactive. Perhaps you're an organisation that doesn't have the privilege of a lot of investment, and therefore your focus is all around compliance and maybe being reactive to training needs versus learning needs without making any judgment on whether that's right or wrong. And as you go up the scale, the sort of direct correlation between an optimized organization is probably much more focused and aligned to driving business performance as a result of learning. And obviously there's stages of sort of that evolution along the way. So I'll just leave that there for a moment. And I'd love to hear from you. I'm just going to launch a poll based on those very limited bullet points and the sort of, you know, the 30 seconds or so you've had to digest this model. I'd love to hear how mature you think your organization is. So I've just launched that now. So please take some time to evolve. That's good. They're coming in. Thank you for those still joining us. You've joined just at the time where we're looking at a poll around the maturity or perceived maturity of your learning organisation. So if you've got a moment, please just take a second to complete that. I think we've got pretty good coverage now.
I'm getting lots of votes coming through, which is great.
So many of you are on the journey already, which is great. I think that's slowed down. I'll just end that now and then share the results. So it's great to see, let me share those. So nearly 40% of you are in the transforming stage, which is great. And if we had more time and more data, it'd be great to hear from some of you and understand which particular sectors maybe that is focused on, and sort of what it is that you're achieving on that journey. You know, a lot of organizations, you know, still in the 16%, perhaps feeling in the siloed space. And again, it would be great to know the context there, because None of these are right or wrong in the opinion. It's all relevant to the organisation and what they're trying to achieve and how important it is. So I would love if we get a chance later to sort of hear a bit more about that, but I appreciate you taking some time, and either you get some comfort in that from some of your peers or perhaps some sort of envy of what other organisations are doing.
Maybe use the chat function, Ollie. Recommend using the chat function if you want to start populating that with some of your views and in terms of why you voted, how you voted.
That would be great. Yeah, by all means, Nick and my colleague Paddy, I notice, is also in there. I'm sure he would love to indulge in the discussion around that. Okay, let's move on. Let me just move that out of the way. So given that, and as I say, 40% of you are in the transforming stage, 30% of you are sort of a bit more targeted, maybe looking to sort of move up that journey. And I suppose it's with that in mind that this statistic particularly stuck out in my mind when we were sort of preparing this discussion, that PwC have quoted that 75% of digital transformation failed to generate returns, which is quite a huge volume if you can imagine the amount of investment and effort and resources that's going into this. Doesn't feel like we've got much chance of success. And this is certainly much sort of broader transformation, and sort of learning within that will be a sort of small proportion of that. And I suppose it's with that we wanted to sort of try and guide and offer some advice and opinion on how do we be part of the 25%. Let's really aim for that. And whilst it's perhaps not possible that you do all of these steps, but some of them I'm sure you do well, some of them may be new, but I think it's like if we can unpack that and just show some improvement towards let's getting to the 25% for our investment, and let's help align ourselves with the business strategy and with the execs to give us more investment than the organisation needs. So I'll pause for a minute there. So let's kick off, and Craig, here perhaps the most obvious starting point is how do we align? Where do we start? This particular part could be certainly considered for any learning program, not just digital, but it's essential. We talk a lot about the why, the evidence of need, like aligning to the business strategy. Clearly it's the best place to start, and how do we do that? What's some of your advice and thoughts of the best way for us to kick off this process?
Yeah, I think it's probably worthwhile just putting into context first that just to align what you talked about, Ollie, which is sort of that working in L&D for 20 years, kind of being in that practitioner role, sort of where I've fallen foul of no structure, no framework. There's lots of digestible stuff out there in terms of literature and white papers, and that, I think, that experience of kind of going through that roller coaster of just trying things out, is that going to work, versus coming into Go One and working with lots of global customers, kind of helped us really kind of digest this and come up with kind of the formula structure. And I think, just to reiterate what Ollie said, this, today it's about sort of being relatable to you and kind of getting some best practice sort of from some of that general consulting elements of it, but also to use that time to sort of reflect on potential blockers and identifying some of those skills. As you've said, step one, so some people it might be the obvious. Back in the early days for me, it wasn't so obvious, because it was one person in an organization trying to solve the world and coming at you from lots of different things. But as you said, I think this is all about the why, in terms of what are we trying to achieve as an organization in terms of our digital offering, and that's in terms of technology as well as employees. Where does that digital element sit as part of the overall organizational strategy? What challenges do we need to overcome? What is that business need? So for me, I think in terms of my experience, and you probably share the same opinion, is that it's really understanding the context in terms of what are we trying to focus on here? Are we focusing on the problem as opposed to the solution? And that's what ideally we need to do. And I kind of often remember, I think as I was going through that sort of journey, talking to a member of my team actually, who likes some L&D professionals. We like to jump in head first, and we get really excited by new opportunities, and particularly in terms of digital, where there's so much offering out there, and particularly in terms of Go One, in terms of the choice, that it's like when you read a book and you wouldn't necessarily jump straight in at chapter 4. The essence is around sort of contextualizing it and understanding the why and what you're starting to achieve. So when you're thinking about the beginning of the book, it's that sort of preface and introduction that's so important, that's all about sort of that scene setting. And I think that then, as an L&D professional, this alignment to the business strategy is all about connecting the dots. It's all about sort of, you're thinking like a jigsaw puzzle. You know what that end result looks like. You know what the outcome is that you want to achieve, potentially when you're sort of aligning it to business strategy. So how do you fit all those jigsaw pieces together? And I think that starting point, which is again going back to that question, is why are we doing this? And then it's about working sort of collectively and collaboratively with the business to come up with that particular solution. So hopefully that kind of sets the scene a little bit.
Yeah, I think that I really like the phrase evidence of need, and we had a similar discussion with Laurie Niles Hoffman and Amanda Nolan on a previous webinar where trying to understand, like, where does that evidence of need come from? And that's not necessarily somebody saying, I have a need for learning to do X. There's a sort of a conspiracy of convenience, I think, that exists with learning, where sort of learning and solutions are sort of arguably thrown at problems that maybe don't understand. So that evidence of need can perhaps come in a different form, whether that's other business metrics, people metrics. So I think, leading on to the next point, like where do we go? Where do L&D professionals go to really help determine A, whether it's a learning need, and then B, sort of how do we sort of get deeper under that skin? Because it's not always possible, I don't think, to sort of focus in on, right, what is the business strategy for this particular learning need? So I think there's, some of this I feel sort of you cut your cloth accordingly for the level of investment and the program that you're looking to make. But I particularly like the evidence of need point. So as we progress on, then let's assume that we've understood that there is a need and it's been validated and it's sort of in line with the strategy. Clearly then we need to sort of go deeper in sort of unpacking the why a bit more. It's sort of, well, what is the analysis? What are the skills? So talk us through that journey and what that looks like.
Yeah, so part of that, Ollie, is not always obvious, like you said. You might not even get to the answer why at that beginning step. So actually this stage is really, really important. As it says, the thorough needs analysis skills to develop. So what does understanding the need look like? Start thinking about the audience. Do you need to challenge stakeholders? So for me, one of the things here is all about sort of that deeper dive, that discovery, in terms of you may have had an initial conversation about, we think we need this, but we're not quite sure. And this is where you can really kind of delve deeper, start trying to understand the individual and functional sort of objectives and outcomes within the organization. But the important thing here is, okay, so if I need to identify what those needs are, what the challenges are, what the outcomes are, I really need to get into the business. So through my industry experience and obviously working with my current customers, what here is really evidential is the how. So how do we understand what people need? And this is where stakeholder engagement is actually key, in terms of obviously whether it's a secret ingredient or whether it's just where we need to go next. And definitely working with Go One customers at the moment. That could start off with one person, but actually could grow arms and legs in terms of what it is that you're trying to achieve. Because sometimes as L&D professionals, again, going back to sort of that reference of jumping to chapter 4 in a book, is we miss out some of those key contacts within the business who have that information that we really kind of need to gather to really kind of inform us of what it is that we actually need to do. And by doing that, by getting that stakeholder engagement really early on, what you're also doing is a real crucial part here, which is you're starting to build relationships, you're starting to build trust, you're starting to understand actually what the organization is going through and where they want to get to in terms of the future, but obviously what the challenges are now. So you constantly going back and forth to this kind of why, until you kind of sort of are gradually scoping out, actually going back to, the why. So stakeholder engagement is really key as part of that.
So is what you're saying here, is this sort of validating, like if the why is the need, the sort of business need, this is the sort of the more granular view from the individual, the team, is that a fair representation of what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. Because in terms of my experience, I'm again working with my customers. Sometimes you don't have the relationships established within the business, so you will go based on who you've spoken to, or an assumption based on what you think is the right thing to do. So I think that if you can go out and you can start talking to people, you start understanding what different audiences and communities across the organization actually really need, and then you can make more of a aligned judgment, but also you've got that data, research and insight in terms of actually, this is what the business wants. What do we do? Where do we go from here?
Yeah. Okay. A couple of comments here that are sort of worth extracting. So Jackie's just said that, stakeholder engagement, not just a tick box exercise, a real game changer. And your point there to sort of the ability to challenge in a collaborative way is valuable. And, I recognise that's not always easy, and sort of how do you get access to those people? So I think we sort of come on to that. And perhaps another area that sort of Gary's referenced is maybe we can bring a couple of real life examples in some of those other points as to bring some of those practical tips. So I'm keeping one eye on the chat. So if I'm looking away, I'm not checking my email. I am keeping to see what's going on. But I think that's helpful. Let's sort of progress on to the sort of stakeholder management in the exec, which I know is a critical one, as to sort of, yes, we understand the need. Yes, we've sort of done some validation, and now, how do you go to exec and sort of make that justification?
I think that's why those previous two steps are so important. I think maybe in the infancy, or even if I was in terms of the maturity model that you've shown, and I was at sort of the first step in terms of my experience as an L&D manager back in the day, is that it's really important that you've done your research. It's really important that you're prepared, because if you don't, then your plan will either fail quite early on, or you won't get that exec buy-in, or you won't get an exec sponsor committed to kind of how can you, with that sort of trajectory journey in terms of what you're trying to do. So it could be, for example, so if we put that into context, I know you just talked about obviously putting some of this into context. I, as an L&D professional, you could be obviously the exec member, or you could be just somebody I'm wanting you to sort of get committed to sponsor this as a project. I could come up to you and say, right, Ollie, I think, due to the pandemic, we kind of really need to kind of move away from face-to-face training, and we need to do something around online.
Yeah, of which I'd probably say why. And actually Brian's point in chat is like, if L&D people are trained to talk financial terms, so as an exec myself, like everything generally will come down to that. So it's sort of, it sounds like you want to do something, like what's that going to achieve? What are you trying to achieve by doing that?
Yeah. So again, if I've not done those previous two steps, I might be unprepared. I might say, well, because other organizations are doing it, or I heard that there may be something happening within the business where they might want to do something around diversity, for an example.
Yeah. And that's, again, sounds great, but sort of, yeah, what's really, why do we need to do that? I thought we were doing that face to face. So what are we going to do that's different?
So again, I might come back and go, I've got no idea. I'm not clear of obviously the strategy. I've actually not spoken to anybody, but it's just what I feel is the right thing to do. So if you think about it in that respect, I've kind of lost that sort of commitment straight away, in terms of I haven't got your ear anymore, because I've not done sort of that preparation. I've not done anything to support my point of view. So I think from my perspective and my experience, again, it's about flipping that on its head. It's about when you go to get exec buy-in, or you need to have sponsorship on a particular initiative or project, it's about engaging with those people really early on, in terms of, look, I'm thinking of doing this. I will go off and I will do whatever I need to, so that I can come back to you. I can be well informed. I can influence you because I've got that justification. I've engaged with stakeholders across the business. So I can really sell to you the benefit of actually wanting to start this journey on this particular project. And really kind of demonstrate to you as an exec member or an exec sponsor, this is what we know, this is what I understand to be happening, and we can look at what that proposal might look like. Because again, in many of these instances, we might be thinking in terms of silo, as this is a priority for us, but as an organization, there might be several priorities. There might be several budgetary constraints associated with those priorities. So all of a sudden you come to the table with maybe 3 new L&D initiatives. None of them might not get signed off, or one of them might do, or all of them. But essentially, if you've done your preparation and everything else, then, and particularly have followed that steps 1 and 2, then that's how you can influence, obviously, that exec buy-in and exec sponsor.
Yeah, I think that's right. You know, there's lots of comments as we're trying to keep up with it. It's a hot topic, right? It's easy to talk about the concept. It's hard to do in reality, and not everything can ultimately end up in a monetary value. And I don't think that's what we're suggesting. In every case, that's the case, but I think it has to be driven back to the demand in a particular business, whether there's a performance issue or a particular metric issue. You know, some of the more obvious areas that are easily trackable in a sales environment. You know, there's particular sales metrics, and you're putting a learning intervention in place or development intervention in place, and you can track that metric and you can put it back to monetary value. That's always the easy one that comes out. I think the harder part becomes when, you know, how do you take maybe a sort of a softer skill, maybe, you know, either leadership or perhaps some of the other topics, and sort of how do you articulate that in a way back to leadership or execs that sort of puts some monetary value. So I do think that's a challenge, and I think we're not going to solve that today, but I think we have to find a way from using data, using evidence from the teams, from the business metrics that exist today to help those conversations. I think one of the challenges that I see over and over again, or sort of I'm challenged by customers, is when they're saying, well, how are you going to measure this impact? And my response is always the same. It's like, how do you measure the lack of impact today? You know, there is no silver bullet from a learning solution that's going to change that impact or measurement. So it's what metric or what performance area are we trying to improve? And that's what should be able to align to the exec. So I think we can spend all day talking about that. And I am fascinated by the comments. And I think what we will do is take some of those comments and maybe have some follow-up discussion that we can respond to that, because there's some great insight from people on the webinar, and really appreciate you taking the time to do that. But
I think the other thing, Ollie, before we move on, is just I was going to cover some of this towards the end, was about sort of that push-pull dynamic, and sometimes you have to be proactive in terms you have to get out there, because everybody else has got their priorities going on within business. And if you want to have a seat at the table, or if you want to influence people in terms of their thinking about going digital or how it can make a difference within the organization, whether it's at functional level or individual level, you've got to go out and you've got to start speaking to people. And that can be so powerful, because what you gain then in terms of insight from speaking to maybe one divisional manager, you can then take that potentially and share it with somebody else. And then before you know it, it's like keeping up with the Joneses. You know, somebody wants to understand why they're doing that. And then that's again where something may come up that could be part of the strategy that actually has not even been discussed at that stage, just purely through going out and being proactive in the organisation.
No, okay. Just one final point before we move on. Isabel made a great point, and I think this is critical, that L&D are often brought in at the point we're just about to talk about. So Isabel, thank you for that prompt. So when we talk about the sort of next phase of designing the learning solution, I think often what you're describing there is that a business head or a team leader is coming to you saying, I need learning, and can I get a course on X, or can I get a solution on that? I'm simplifying it for these benefits. So I think it is really critical that you need to try and find a way to get back to step 1, 2, or 3. And that's a cultural challenge in some organizations, that they might not engage you earlier. But if you just jump into step 4, it's going to be a lot harder, because people are assuming it's a learning need, assuming what the issue is, and sort of come in to say, can you just go and buy me a solution or build me a solution? So Isabel, thank you for sharing that. So I guess coming on to that, let's assume we've done some great analysis. We really understand the metrics and things are looking great. Now we kind of into a complex world of choosing the best content for that audience, or best solution. And, you know, whilst I work for an online business, I'm not professing that online and digital is the only answer to everything. There's a plethora of ways that we can deliver it. But in the context of digital and assessing the most appropriate content for the audience and outcomes, what are the things that we really need to focus on to sort of give us the most chance of success?
Yeah, so again, obviously, making sure that you've obviously got the awareness of those previous steps that we've talked about. And I think that that's where again, at this stage, that stakeholder engagement is still really, really key, because I think once you want to understand how to support the digital strategy for individual departments or the organisation as a whole, again, that sort of deeper delve is really, really important. And I think it's, again, some really key questions here that are posed. You know, what's worked, what hasn't worked, and why. Being quite conscious that actually you're not trying to break stuff that already works, because that's not the point of L&D. If something has worked for a number of years, and actually there's by implementing and doing something completely differently, it's not going to change anything, then there's no point sort of forcing that conversation. But what we can do is we can open eyes and open ears across the organisation, so that we can say, well, here's a digital offering over here. You might still get what you get, but actually it's more flexible for you, it's more adaptable, it's going to save you some money. It's going to help provide personalised learning. You're going to have it's going to support you in terms of succession planning, in terms of your management population. So I think, again, getting out and understanding people's world will help really kind of inform you to choosing the best learning content or the best learning solution, digital solution in our respect, that will support that business and those stakeholders going forward. And again, this is an evolving step, because I think from my experience, particularly working with our Go On global customers, is once you start having a conversation with somebody and you start sharing, you know, what's possible, what I found is that individuals within that organisation said, oh, I think you need to speak to person X over here and person Y in this part of the organisation, because they're thinking of doing something, but they don't know where to start. So sometimes it can just be an initial conversation that actually spirals into something that's definitely worthwhile pursuing, because if you can start sometimes with some of those quick wins where people are actually engaged and they want to try something differently and move, you know, along the times, then that's absolutely fine. I think you'd mentioned in step 3, there's kind of like the resistance. It's not all smooth sailing. You are going to get the resistance. So it's about just sharing those views, sharing what's possible, and then obviously making sure that you're still aligning stuff to the business strategy, the individual and departmental objectives and outcomes, which is really key.
I think also, you know, in terms of the audience, and you know, not necessarily one size fits all. I think in a non-digital environment, it's perhaps a bit less about the style and sort of format, whereas in a digital format, you know, it's sort of preference of style. Does someone like animated? Does someone want it to be a bit more interactive? So I think the choice becomes a lot harder. It's not just the subject matter and the outcome, but it's the format and style, and perhaps what else might need to be wrapped around it. Is sort of my point of sort of build it and they will come. You know, just delivering a piece of digital content to someone may or may not solve a particular skills gap. So I think there's sort of a number of considerations in here about the audience preference. And then there's again a comment in the chat about not everybody in that team is going to be the same. And I think that's part of the flexibility that digital provides, where perhaps it's the same content, but delivered by maybe different providers or a different style that's still focused on that gap. So I think that's sort of you know, an interesting opportunity that presents in digital to provide a more personalized experience than just on in another form. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think particularly even within Go One, you know, Go One solution offers all of that, which is fantastic. You know, having short form, longer duration from a different eclectic mix of providers is fantastic, because then you're starting to think about the learner preferences within the organisation. You know, this particular department over here needs to have content that is, you know, 15 minutes, dip in, dip back out again, but it's supporting maybe an internal program within that team, versus this particular non-operational function within the business. They need something where it's modular, it's a modular approach, or they need something whereby, again, they can nip in, or there's a longer piece in there in terms of it's associated with an award or promotion or succession planning, whatever the case may be. So definitely around that. And then the other bit is also around, sometimes as L&D professionals, we are expected to know everything. So again, getting out within the business and understanding their world also potentially gives you points of contact like subject matter experts and people like that, so that you can get them involved with assisting you in choosing the right content, whether it's relevant, whether it's, like you said, animated, short form, long form, etc., etc. So definitely is key.
Okay, well, that sort of tees up nicely the next point around sort of testing that content. So what are we referring to here to sort of validate that process and that solution?
Yeah, so in my experience with organisations, you either go big bang, you go full scale in. You might do a full scale pilot, or you might sort of just drip things in sort of momentarily. And I think that where this has been quite useful with the organisations I've worked with, and definitely when I was head of L&D at my previous organisation, is having a degree of focus group. So getting people engaged at different times, whether that's a formal focus group or one where you're sort of just drip feeding that content through. So again, going back to sort of what I talked about in terms of getting sort of some subject matter experts involved, so particularly around the technical space, whereby if you're an L&D professional who hasn't worked with those research and development or engineering type departments before, and you're being asked to find digital content that's specific to their needs, sometimes it can completely go over your head. So actually having those points of contact within a business is really, really useful, because they will test particularly the relevance piece of the content. Because as L&D professionals, I think, we can look at stuff and say, right, we know that it's short form, it's long form, we know how it's going to culturally potentially fit, but then it's about testing that theory and putting that into practice. And I think that that's where, again, those relationships that you're building to sort of test that content is really valid, and obviously validates what you're doing before you're then providing it to the wider population within the business. And
when we're testing the content, the focus group, this is sort of critical. We've done all the hard work of doing the analysis and the sort of evidence of need, etc. How is that validated at this stage? Because is that I can imagine that might be a bit more subjective with a learner. So, I didn't like that course, or I think it should be something different. And perhaps if the evidence of need has come from a different source, have you got any insight? Put you on the spot a bit there. Sort of insights of examples of that, or sort of how that tension is managed, or is that sort of about stakeholder management? And as you say, if you've got the relationships, it's kind of being open to say, thanks for the feedback, but actually the intention of this program was to do X, and this is why we're doing it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so a bit of the latter that you just talked about, but also I think it's about almost putting a restriction on those groups of people that you sort of getting to validate the content, and also being clear about what it is that you want those stakeholders to validate. So if it's specifically around the relevance, then obviously make that clear. Again, working with some of the Go One customers, we're validating, we'll get in focus groups to validate the content for a number of different reasons. And quite simplistically, we use kind of like almost like a RAG status, like, 3 would be, green would be absolutely fantastic, this would be great. We're then getting comments and feedback saying this would be particularly good for these particular levels of management within a business, for example, or these particular groups of people or audiences within the organisation, versus this will probably be okay, doesn't set the world alight, but it's great, versus this actually wouldn't culturally fit with us. So I think what we do is we try and restrict those groups, because obviously if you start having too many people involved with making those decisions, some people could go, this is great, and some people could go, this is not what we like. So you're almost like the L&D professional is got to influence these communities. The other thing that's really good about this as well is, if you haven't considered engaging stakeholders in the past, this is a real great opportunity to start creating some hype. And again, if people are involved with testing content, they'll be talking to, they'll be having corridor conversations going, oh, what's this you're working on? Or somebody saying, I'm working on this particular thing, I'm part of a focus group, and all of a sudden they want to understand what's going on. So it's the start of creating some hype. You can start getting advocates on learning. So again, if you're going to create those focus groups, be conscious about who you're going to choose, but don't put all your positive people into that pot. You need some cynics from within the business to test that theory, to make sure that you've kind of done that sort of due diligence bit. And then the third piece is actually, it's that start of creating a learner community. So there's a webinar that we did a couple of weeks ago, which is all about sort of creating that learner community. And I think as soon as you start engaging stakeholders and getting involved with testing the content and all that type of stuff, it just starts to create that, and does that internal marketing for you to start off in the process.
Okay, that's good. I mean, there's a couple of questions that are sort of coming up here around sort of the focus groups of mixed learner preferences, learning styles, some debate of learning styles that we'll sort of get into now. But I think the point here is, yes, you need a mix of the audience is the first point. And the other one I just sort of caught my eye is Jeffrey's comment of, if the strategy makes sense in the first place, aligning outcomes to a dodgy strategy is a thankless task. So I think that sort of demonstrates the point of kind of the evidence of need. If there's a clear strategy and a challenge that you're trying to address, then it's worth doing. But if it's not clear, then arguably don't bother going on this journey if it's not going to deliver impact. So
absolutely
good start. I'm just slightly conscious of the time, so just sort of let's move on to the last sort of few points of let's assume we're up and running. This is maybe talking about something that's at scale. So just sort of want to touch on this, and then just sort of really spend a bit more time on the sort of final points, which I think bring it together in terms of sort of metrics and sort of how you continue. But maybe just sort of pull out the sort of top 2 points on we've done the focus group, we've got some engagement, it seems to be working. How do we then start to implement this? What are the sort of 2 or 3 things that we should really think about to make sure this is going to be a success? And in your point at the end there, all good plans are great. I think Mike Tyson said, wasn't it, all good plans are great till you get punched in the face. So when you get the proverbial punch in the face, there's no doubt what happened. How do we adapt?
Yeah, I think the important thing here is preparation planning is key. What's your plan for implementation? Are you going to go light touch or big bang? Who's going to be involved with that? Do you need to have a marketing communication plan, which may obviously then mean the involvement of others? There's the momentum piece as well. So how do you gain momentum actually before launching your program, but also how do you gain and maintain that momentum post that? Have you thought of ongoing campaigns? How are you going to monitor levels of engagement? Because again, and how are you going to sort of drive continuous adoption? Again, part of this is about, sometimes in my experience, particularly in the early days, you put in a new solution and then you think it's all going to go swimmingly well. And you naturally, with things that we implement, particularly from a learning perspective, is you have that initial spike and then all of a sudden that can tail off because people get bored or they're on to the next thing. So I think as L&D professionals, we need to think about how we're going to run that program, but how can we adapt if things sort of start to tailor off? Then is that sort of, like you said there, Ollie, what happens if things that don't go to plan? Again, that's in the preparation. I always used to have this conversation with my team, which is the what ifs. So don't think things are going to go rosy, always be prepared for the what ifs. Think about the 10 steps ahead. So if you haven't got the engagement, what is your plan? Are you going to run some campaigns? If you go big bang and obviously things start to go chaotic or it doesn't work, that's where, again, the testing the pilots, that the testing the content prior and those other stages are so important to do, sort of leading up to that. So I think it's the preparation, it's the plan moving forward, and then it's the case of don't just chuck a solution in and just hope it's going to work. Like, you need to be close to it and make sure that it's going to continue to be a success.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. I suppose the sort of we sort of loosely role played the sort of role of the exec and getting the sign off on these investments, and ultimately it's sort of coming back and demonstrating the value, whether that to be to leadership or to the organisation. So you've got sort of 3 great points there. Again, sort of what are some of the pitfalls and maybe a couple of examples, practical examples we can share of sort of how to do this really well.
Yeah, so I think this is where sort of as you mentioned, the previous steps are really key, because if you've done those previous steps, you haven't jumped in at chapter 4, you haven't jumped in at chapter 8, you've got that proof and you've got that evidence to share. I think the data and the insights can almost become your best friend or your best ally. So whether that's through reporting, whether that's through referencing back to the needs and the outcomes and objectives, or even down to sort of the insights through those relationships that you build with the key stakeholders across the business. Now it's based on sort of that ongoing journey and what have you collectively and collaboratively being able to resolve, working together. So I think that all of those steps are so key in terms of reaching this point. And I think that's why sometimes it can fail, because we jump in head first and we try and run before we can walk. So I think that's definitely key, and I've definitely found that within organisations that I've worked with prior to Go One, and obviously with the customers that we work with now. And I think it also goes back to that sort of push-pull dynamic, and making sure that you kind of raised visibility of the initiative or the project itself. You've raised the visibility of L&D, becoming that strategic partner, so really understanding that the business, and then it doesn't become such a hard sell. And I think that that's what I've experienced over the years, is if you do that sort of due diligence piece, you follow some sort of structure, you follow those steps that we've talked about. We're not saying guarantee that it'll work every time, but actually if you have some sort of framework, it's going to help a lot easier to be able to measure that impact and show that evidence. Yeah. And it should just be there on paper.
Yeah, I'm picking up a comment here from Jackie. I know there was a discussion in the chat about, I think Jason made a point of sort of measuring productivity as a good impact. I think Jackie summed it up here to say, she worked well with functional heads to define the metrics up front, so that those functional heads are not just bought in, just for the need, but also the critical part of this is that their role in supporting the learning transfer. Again, just delivering a digital program may or may not solve your challenge, but it's important. Like, have you got the right environment? Have you got the right management in place that kind of continues those conversations and helps embed that? So I think, we haven't necessarily put that on here, but Jackie, thank you for sharing that, because I think that's a key part that brings together the evidence of need up front. And that's definitely a collaborative exercise that the business can't tell L&D what to do, and L&D can't tell the business what to do. It has to be a collaborative process to agree, like, what is it, why are we even doing this? What do we want to make an impact to? How are we going to measure the success? And then it's much easier to come back at the end and say, great, we said we wanted to improve productivity. This is how we were measuring it. And all things being equal, these are the ways that we've done that. So I think that emphasizes that point, that this is a partnership. This is not done to anybody, or it has to be done with somebody. So, yeah. Okay. So sort of last but not least, I suppose sort of point 8. This is around. I suppose I've covered some of that in terms of the sort of continuous learning. Did you achieve what you set out to do? Have we got the right measurement? How are we evaluating it, etc. So just maybe conclude with that, and then I'd love to hear more from our audience in terms of we've got a poll as to sort of which areas that are most relevant, but also would love to take a couple of questions if we have a bit of time. So maybe just conclude us with sort of how do we continue to learn and improve this cycle?
Yeah, so I think the first couple of questions are around sort of that crucial sort of lessons learned piece, and I don't know how many other people on the webinar today share the same view, but often we will be juggling multiple different projects. And as soon as one started, we've started another one. And so we don't spend enough time taking a step back and actually go in, did we actually set out what we wanted to achieve? What's worked, what didn't work, what should we be doing differently? Because you can apply that then to other potential projects, but also what it makes you think about is, have you considered the next steps? So again, we work very much on this continuous learning cycle, which is working with customers. It shouldn't be, this is what we set out to do, in it goes, see you later, we've moved on to the next, we'll speak to you again soon. It's that, like you said, it's that continuous partnership that you have, and it's the evolvement of those particular initiatives as well, and making sure that they have that sort of legacy continues and the longevity of those particular projects are also continue. So that's where those top couple of questions come from, and particularly that, have you considered the next steps before you just go, we've done the job here and we move on. And I think the final one on here, which often gets missed off actually, is the blood effort, sort of the effort, the blood, the sweat, the tears that goes into some of these initiatives and projects. We often overlook. There's no sort of praise and recognition. There's no pats on the back. And I think that that's something that we shouldn't undervalue as L&D professionals. We should really kind of look at how we can celebrate success and make this continue, because again, as I've mentioned before, it's about also raising the profile of L&D and celebrating what you've done, but also that celebration of how the collaborative and collective approach and that partnership that you talked about can be celebrated and can be built on for the future needs of the organisation.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, very good. Thank you. I'm conscious we're coming up to the end of the time. There are a couple of questions that I would like to try and tackle, although we could have a whole webinar based on some of these. But just before we do that, to sort of get a bit of insights from the audience, I'm just going to post a poll of which of these areas do you feel you or your organisation perhaps need to invest more time and effort into. So a strong front runner early doors for exec buy-in and demonstrating value to leadership. We perhaps all could have predicted those ones, which is good to sort of give that a few. One of the questions, just while that's coming up, there's a sort of interesting debate here that I wonder we could just quickly tackle. So Stephen asked, how will digital L&D impact organisational culture, vice versa? Darren's come back to say, well, does culture transfer to the digital platform? So do you have any observation? If we had time, I might even ask Darren if he could come on and just explain that a bit more. But I think it's an interesting one. I'll give my 2 pennies worth, and then perhaps you can add to it. Because I'm often asked, like, can we help organisations change a learning culture? And my answer is always no. Like, technology alone and digital L&D is not going to do that. Culture isn't driven by the technology or the solution. It's driven by a number of other factors across the organisation. So that's maybe a very simplistic view. I don't know if you've got anything more sophisticated you'd want to add.
Sophisticated and me in one question. I don't know if they go well together. So I think a lot of it comes down to the evidence of need and the insights and the data that you have. A bit like what you just said there about there are a number of different factors that will influence, obviously, the culture, the digital culture or the learning culture in itself. I think what will help is it will build and it will evolve over time. So with many things, it's not going to happen overnight. But I think if you've got the evidence to showcase and share with the organisation that actually the impact of digital, whether it's technology or people or a combination of the both, is helping drive that learning culture or drive the digital culture, that you can only build on that. And I think if it's missing, then you haven't got a chance in hell of obviously justifying that and evidencing it.
I actually want to sort of unpick that kind of that, Darren. I would love to have that conversation and perhaps a future webinar of sort of how that might work. I'm just sort of conscious of the time, but yeah, I definitely have that view that it's not there's no silver bullet to change that, and the chat is continuing that I'll move away from. So just to kind of bring it to conclusion, I really appreciate your time. I'm conscious we're going over and we're sort of losing people rapidly, but you know what this sort of demonstrates is, as I said, we could have predicted. Exec buying is the one that's the hardest to achieve. That's been a story for a number of years and sort of linked to that demonstrated value. Interesting, you know, not a lot of time, more time needed in terms of aligning to business strategy, only 7%, which is great. So it seems like we're doing a good job of understanding what's needed, perhaps a little bit more time and effort needed on sort of the analysis to sort of help us convince the exec. So I think let's take some of that analysis, bring it back, and I think we'll have some follow-up content to this, and I'd love for this community to contribute to that, and we've got some ways of doing so. So I just want to sort of thank everybody for their time today. I am conscious of the time. I will be following up with that. A couple of things to sort of conclude is that, you know, we are going to be running a series of L&D leaders roundtables, one of which hosted by Laura Overton. So some fascinating topics there. So if you are interested in joining us for that, please contact Tom, whose email address is there. And we'll sort of see what spaces we've got available. And one of the things that I'm passionate about trying to do within the environment in the industry, would sort of build that community and have some of those fascinating debates that exist within chat rooms and at conferences around the country. So if you want to join us for that, then please let us know. And finally, if you wanted to know more about Go One and sort of hear about some of our experience, please get in touch with me directly or via the website. But that sort of leaves me just to say thank you very much. We will follow up all of the questions and sort of thoughts, and think of a way that can sort of share that collective wisdom, because it's very we really do appreciate your time and effort in a busy environment where your collective knowledge helps the industry grow better. So we'll find a way to honour that and sort of bring that out into some assets for the future. So thanks very much for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day and your week, and we'll see you again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you both. That was a great session, and thank you everyone for joining us. Great to see so many people participating in the chat. We've got some good debate in there, which is really good to see. I know that a few people asked about the slides being shared, and as Ollie said, yes, we slides, recordings, etc. Yeah, we can share those with you. So thanks again. Thank you, Ollie. Thank you, Craig, so much for your time. To exit the session, all you have to do is close the window. So we will leave it there. Thank you very much.